मैं भारत का संविधान हूँ।
जानिए अपने संविधान को।
Good afternoon. In the Know Your Constitution series, we are going to take up the issue of fundamental duties. As we all know, from 12 days from now, we observe the Republic Day on January 26th. In fact, it was 70 years ago in 1950 that we gave to ourselves this Constitution, which was adopted by the Constituent Assembly on 26 November 1949. Since then, we also celebrate November 26th as a Constitution Day. Today we are looking at a very important segment of the Constitution, which is part of the Directive Principles, and we're going to take a look at the fundamental duties which came up into the Constitution as an amendment in the year 1976. To discuss more of a threadbare about the fundamental duties, we have with us Mr. P.T. Acharya, the former Secretary General of Lok Sabha and a constitutional expert in this. Welcome, Mr. Acharya, for this.
Thank you.
First and foremost, if I were to ask you for a preface to the fundamental duties, which was originally not part of the Constitution when it was adopted in 1949 and came into force from 1950 onwards, but as our listeners would like to understand, I think it was brought into the Indian Constitution by an amendment in 1976, and since then it preceded it by a committee by Sir Swaran Singh. If you could give a brief historical perspective to the incorporation of the fundamental duties.
Yes, you are right, Mr. Prasad. Actually, this was brought into the Constitution through an amendment, and which came into effect in 1977. It was actually during emergency, the internal emergency which was imposed, and then so Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister, she thought that she should add fundamental duties to the Constitution. In fact, you must know that during that period, 42nd Amendment to the Constitution was brought, and it made very basic and fundamental changes in the Constitution of India. So it was actually a part of that process that fundamental duties were also incorporated in the Constitution. There are about, and then the Prime Minister entrusted the task of examining it to Mr. Swaran Singh, a very senior Congress leader, and was minister in the Central Cabinet for a very long time. And he went into this, he studied the whole issue, and he came up with a suggestion that we must incorporate fundamental duties also in the Constitution so that we can make the people conscious of the rights of the duties which they have to perform, because we have, the Constitution contains fundamental rights and so many other rights which the citizens enjoy, but the Constitution does not talk about duties. So we must have a chapter on duties so that the people become very conscious about the duties of the citizens. As citizens, they have to perform these duties, and they owe it to the nation to be conscious about these duties, and they perform these duties. So this was, in fact, in short, the background against which the fundamental duties were incorporated in the Constitution. And then an amendment was brought before both the Houses of Parliament. Amendment was passed, and it became a part of the Constitution, and that is how Article 51A was brought in the Constitution.
Yeah, to go by the record, it was the 42nd Amendment of Act of 1976, which came into effect from 3rd January 1977.
Right.
Mr. Acharya, if I were to quickly run through the 10 fundamental duties initially, which was part of the 1976 amendment, and of course the 11th one added much later when I think the right to education move came into being. The first 10, of course, if I were to read section by section, yeah. Article 51A, fundamental duties. It shall be the duty of every citizen of India, A, to abide by the Constitution and respect its ideals and institutions, the national flag and the national anthem. B, to cherish and follow the noble ideals which inspired our national struggle for freedom. C, to uphold and protect the sovereignty, unity and integrity of India. D. To defend the country and render national service when called upon to do so. E. To promote harmony and the spirit of common brotherhood amongst all the people of India, transcending religious, linguistic and regional or sectional diversities, to renounce practices derogatory to the dignity of women. F. To value and preserve the rich heritage of our composite culture. G. To protect and improve the natural environment including forests, lakes, rivers and wildlife, and to have compassion for living creatures. H. To develop the scientific temper, humanism and the spirit of inquiry and reform. I. To safeguard public property and to abjure violence. J. To strive towards excellence in all spheres of individual and collective activity, so that the nation constantly rises to higher levels of endeavor and achievement. K, which was the amendment which was brought about in the year 2002, which came into effect much later in 2010, is who is a parent or a guardian to provide opportunities for education to his child, or as the case may be, ward between the age of 6 and 14 years. If I were to take the broad overview of all the 11 duties now part of the Constitution, initially taken as the 11th came in, it gives a very broad sweep of the Indian ethos, culture, heritage, the way we all have been brought about in the familial atmosphere, the values that this system that is that the correct assessment?
Well, certainly, these fundamental duties which have been listed out here are very fundamental so far as citizens of an organized polity are concerned. Now, these duties always existed. When we organize ourselves into a society, certainly every citizen of an organized polity will have to observe or perform these duties. He must be conscious about these duties. So, from that point of view, there is nothing new about these duties. These duties always existed. The only thing is that these duties were not listed out in any document as such. For example, the abide by the Constitution and respect its ideals and institutions.
National flag and national
anthem. What is new about it? Every citizen is supposed to do that. And then I think it has a much larger dimension when I look at it. The institutions of democracy, parliament, the judiciary, these are institutions, vital institutions of democracy. And every citizen is duty bound to protect and preserve these very hallowed institutions of democracy. And even if it is not there as a part of the Constitution, all citizens are bound to be conscious about it and act on it. That is the thing. Now, for example, it is our duty to preserve democracy. It is our duty to preserve and protect the hallowed institutions of democracy. And so, similarly,
Mr. Achary, if I were to take you a little more, this has also come up in the context, if you look at it, recently this thing has come up again of the reminder of national duties, fundamental duties, because much has been always talked about the rights of the people, the fundamental rights bestowed. So simultaneously, I think this is the flip side, or if you say the other side, that with the, as you say, rights comes also with the responsibility. Similarly, rights also come with duties.
Well, let us not counterpose the duties to the rights. I have heard some people saying that we have had so many rights and the Constitution talks only about rights and Constitution has given us all rights, but we are not conscious about our duties, which is perhaps not a fact. Because there is no point, these are not opposites. These are part of a whole. So, you cannot say that we have had rights so far and now from here onwards we will have duties. That is not how it is. There is no muhurt or something to start being conscious about duties. So, duties and responsibilities duties and rights are an integral part of the whole system, and therefore duties, my basic proposition is that duties always existed for the citizens to perform as a part of an organized polity.
If I were to take the first, you just mentioned Clause A, of course Clause B is also to cherish and follow the noble ideals which inspired our national struggle for freedom. This is part of our hoary past, and we all know the freedom struggle that the country went through under the Mahatma Gandhi's leadership, and the issues. Then uphold the protect and integrity of unity of India. Now if I were to take you to the section on promote harmony and spirit of common brotherhood amongst all the people of India, transcending religion, linguistic. It says renounce practices derogatory to the dignity of women. That's very significant because gender sensitivity is something again very crucial and also very important, and this is something that keeps coming up periodically. We keep revisiting the issue on issues of gender sensitivity and gender equality. When the Constitution bestowed rights, equal rights to every citizen, and I think the Indian Constitution gave voting rights to women, which even a country like America took several, maybe a century to give it to the rights, and maybe other Western democracies too.
That is true, absolutely true, because our Constitution, the basic thrust of our Constitution is that all men are equal. Men means the women also. All are equal before law, and that, of course, is in conformity with the Article 7 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, certainly women need special protection, and we have many provisions in the Constitution which are in favor of affirmative action in favor of women. So the Constitution has been very conscious about it and very particular about it. The Constitution made enough provisions for that, and certainly here the government and the whole society, we have become more and more conscious about the gender equality and the right of women. In fact, we became conscious of the fact that women need more protection, and that's why we have become, or we are on to becoming, a gender conscious society, gender equality conscious society. But of course there are aberrations, which take place in every society, and we have adequate laws to deal with all these various aberrations. Wherever the women are mistreated, certainly the law will step in and the law will correct it. So that is the way, because we have a rule of law in this country, and that rule of law takes care of all these various aberrations that take place in our society.
You're listening to All India Radio and Know Your Constitution discussion. Welcome back. This is Know Your Constitution series, and we are discussing the fundamental duties as part of it with Mr. P.D.T. Acharya, former Secretary General Lok Sabha and a constitutional expert. Mr. Acharya, as we were discussing a while ago, we talked about the dignity of women as intrinsic, and which was drafted into the fundamental duties. What also attracts your attention is also another issue, is where we say to protect and improve the natural environment, including forests, lakes, rivers, wildlife, and having compassion for living creatures. Now, in 1976, when probably environment was not such a big in terms of as a public discourse, people talked about environment. There was the Chipko movement. Much later, there was this famous sanctuary in Kerala, if you remember, the wildlife sanctuary, which at one point of time the Silent Valley protested. So environment has always been a conscious, Indian heritage has been talked about living in harmony with the environment, in nature, in consonance with nature. And this is again, if you now find in the 21st century or where we are even, this has taken a huge leaps and bounds, and people are talking in terms of how environment, whole climate change issue has become an international issue. It's a global matter. This is something is also, if you look at it, the drafters, the Swaran Singh committee which went into it, looked at it from a very, very long-term perspective with a vision.
Certainly, that vision is displayed here, In fact, the protection of environment, is of very prime concern. And I must say that the Indian citizens are increasingly aware of the danger to the environment that is taking place due to various factors. But at the same time, I must also say that perhaps we are not taking adequate measures to protect the environment. Now, environment does not mean merely forest. Environment is a whole concept, and there air comes, water comes, and so many other vital things which are required for human life come in there. And we were, in fact, in Delhi, we were actually facing the atmospheric pollution, the air pollution caused by so many other factors, and also stubble burning and all that. See, the point is, being conscious about environmental protection is not enough. We ought to act immediately. So, duty is one part of it. Yes, people are conscious about it. You should not contribute to polluting the atmosphere or cutting down the forest. But at the same time, the action has to come from the organized government. And only then, the problem can be addressed effectively. Sometimes we find that such action is missing or is not adequate. With the result, the environmental pollution to which the people are exposed, that continues, causing a lot of danger to the life of the people here. Certainly, as an item, we should be put in the list of fundamental duties. It's good, it's well thought of, but at the same time, action to control or to address the problems arising out of environmental pollution is very, very necessary.
Yeah, I think that's where we look at, we all are aware of these issues, we know it is a duty, but what are we going to do about it? And how each individual citizen can contribute to better the environment, because it talks of to protect and improve the natural environment, including forest and all. Yeah. Mr. Acharya, the next entry, of course, is equally interesting and very, very well thought out, if one would say, to develop the scientific temper, humanism, and the spirit of inquiry and reform. Now, once again, we have a history, a very ancient history where we are known as with research. And since the independence, the country's leading political and administrators talked about scientific temper being inculcated. The institutions of excellence, institutions of high engineering, medical, and other issues, social sciences, they've all been developed over a period of time. And this is essentially to inculcate the scientific temper and the spirit of inquiry, and let the children explore and analyze things as it comes, so that unless you have an inquiring mind, you don't grow into a knowledge society that our forefathers want India to be.
Well, so far as the scientific temper is concerned, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, used to often talk about that. We must develop, promote that, we must inculcate that scientific temper. Because after all, we are living in an age where every development is a result of science, advancement in science. The human society has made significant advances in the realm of science. And without science, you cannot live. So that is a situation. But then
today we are talking of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, that is the thing. So it is not mere talk of science. What Nehru wanted was inculcate scientific temper. That is something which is much greater than what we understand. In today's world, or in today's India particularly, it is very, very necessary to inculcate this temper, the scientific temper, so that we develop a scientific outlook on issues. We tend to become a little superstitious, because maybe that is because of the kind of legacy that we have inherited from the past. But earlier we were not like that. We had a very inquisitive mind. If you go to the Upanishadic period, the entire Upanishad is a question and answer. That means inquiry. It leads you to the greater truth. So that used to be the case in those days. But somehow we lost it on the way, And now there is a need, urgent need to recover that, the scientific and inculcate this scientific temper and scientific outlook in life, so that we can shed all these superstitious things which only hold us back and take us backward.
In fact, if you remember way back in the year 2000 onwards, APJ Abdul Kalam, the then President of India, always stressed when he was interacting with especially the youth and children, was to how to develop India into a knowledge society. And that was his, and since he had this, since he was known as the missile man with a scientific bent of mind, he believed that's the one way the country and had a great future and potential. If I were to take the other issue, which is now to safeguard public property and abjure violence. Now, this is again come into, if you look at the recent instances, and there is a Supreme Court judgment or a directive, if I were to say, if you could throw light in particular what has happened in the case of state trying to recovering costs for acts of violence and in particular damage to public property. Since you also have law and you practice in the court, could you throw light on that?
Well, this this can be looked at from different points of view. It's not a very simple thing that a government recovering damage from the people who they believe have damaged the property. Now, how much, how far a government can go with this? Will it put an end to violence for all times to come? That is not what we learn from the history. If you look at the history of the world, particularly the democratic struggles and the various struggles which have taken place at different points of time in the history, in the world, people, certainly there were revolutions, and in revolution there was violence, and naturally a lot of public damage to public property must have taken place. But then it was a part of a movement for bringing about some change. But as a legal proposition, certainly one can agree that people should not resort to violence. In a democracy particularly, there is no place for violence. And this is a country which believes in ahimsa, that is non-violence. That is our basic credo.
Mahatma Gandhi's struggle,
yeah, the whole freedom struggle was fought on the basis of that. So we have a greater responsibility, I must say, to promote non-violence and abjure violence. So naturally there cannot be two opinions on that. And nobody will probably disagree with that.
And also safeguarding public property, because public is the people, and it's people's property. It's nobody. I mean, what is owned by the state.
That's a beautiful theoretical proposition, I must say. The entire property belongs to the public, so naturally, a very enlightened public, should never do anything which will damage the property. It's a beautiful legal proposition, and it's a very ideal thing. But if you look at the history of the world, it doesn't happen that way. There have been violence. I mean, there are violent uprising and great upheavals in the world at different times in history. So, if you look at it from that point of view, then perhaps I do not know what it will lead to and how long a government can continue with this kind of a measure.
Well, the fact is we also have said that with safeguarding public property is also to abjure violence, and as you pointed out in the preface of this, ahimsa has been integral part of the Indian culture.
Certainly.
And something that the very ballast for the freedom struggle of Mahatma Gandhi. If I were to take you to this, the amendment of the 2002, which came into being in 2010, is the who is a parent or a guardian to provide opportunities for education to his child, or as the case may be, ward between the age of 6 and 14. Now, this is essentially linked to the Right to Education Act, which came into being in the UPA 2 government. Could you throw some light on the historical?
Actually, this, this has been a part of the directive principles of state policy, and then this became a part of the fundamental duties. And then we enacted a constitutional amendment to give the freedom of education,
compulsory
education to our children of this age group. And because this has been a major concern of our governments and our society, because in India at the time of independence, the the level of literacy was very, very low. And from there, we had to move forward, and we have moved forward. We have covered a lot of distance. But still, there were difficulties. So naturally, those difficulties had to be addressed by a welfare government, a government which was conscious of its democratic duties. That is why these various, although the directive principles of state policy and also the fundamental rights are not enforceable as such, but still these are very important documents which are a part of the Constitution and which expresses the will of the society to improve this particular area, to take adequate measures to address this problem. So that is why the directive principles of state policy, then the fundamental duties, and then ultimately it resulted in an enactment amending the Constitution, providing for this right as a fundamental fundamental right.
And duty placed upon the parent or the ward.
Certainly.
That it's their responsibility to send their ward to and allow them access to education.
Yeah, that goes without saying. That child has to be taken care of by the parent. And if the parents are not there, then naturally the guardians. So they have to take care of the children. Because children are our assets. And if you don't take care of the children, their health and their education, their mental growth, their physical growth, then what will happen to this country? After all, today, we are a young nation. We are so proud of our youth.
50%.
If you don't take care of our children, then India will be left with no youth on whom the country can depend.
In this, I would like to bring one particular element, since you must have also been witness to the debates at that point of time when this right to education became an act. Very lofty, difficult, challenging task, because this country, we've had issues with infrastructure for school, teaching systems, because there's so many methods that have been followed. But this is a challenge that remains being addressed. It's a work in progress if I were to look at it.
It is certainly a work in progress because of the lack of adequate infrastructure. That's a problem which needs to be addressed on an urgent basis. But the point is that this was put in the Constitution to generate enough of compulsion to proceed towards that and allocate resources so that this target could be achieved. So unless it is put as a part of the Constitution or as a law, then we may not do it enough, or we may not do enough in this regard. That is why, to generate that compulsion, when it is there in the Constitution, naturally it generates enough of compulsion in the government of the day to provide enough of resources to achieve this goal.
In fact, the resources are something which is very scarce, because the kind of demands are increasing and across sectors, and the lofty ideal is to have something like 6% of GDP earmarked for education, and I think we're far away from the target. Successive budgets show that we are not able to protect.
We are far below that. Despite this being a part of the Constitution, we have not been able to allocate enough of resources for education, particularly that sector of education which deals with the children.
So this is something, as I said, that's a work in progress, and because education is also a state subject, in the sense states have their own, and the implementation are states. So this is a challenge, this is a work in progress, and I think the fundamental duty which incorporated in the latest amendment in the 2002 and came into being in 2010, that was a broad overview of the fundamental duties of the Indian Constitution under the Know Your Constitution series of All India Radio. Thank you.
मैं भारत का संविधान हूँ।
जानिए अपने संविधान को।